A Thursday night in October. One of the most expensive restaurants in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. Soft amber lighting. White linen tablecloths pressed so flat they look like fresh snow. The kind of quiet that takes effort and money to maintain, where even the silverware seems to understand it should behave. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit is holding court at the best corner table in the room, the one with the full sightline, the one that says before he has uttered a single word that whoever is sitting there chose to sit there deliberately. He's laughing too loud for the room.
It was worth it though.
Talking too fast. Gesturing with the practiced confidence of someone who has spent decades making sure every room he enters understands he has arrived. Across from him sit three men in expensive but quieter suits, the kind of men who don't need to perform because their net worth does the performing for them. They are listening. They are nodding. And the man in the charcoal suit, the one who reserved this table 2 weeks in advance, who ordered the wine before his guests arrived, who has been rehearsing this evening in his head since the moment it was scheduled, is doing exactly what he planned to do. He is closing. He is performing. He is the most powerful person in the room and he knows it and he needs everyone else to know it too. And then something small happens. A small mistake. A misplaced bill. A glance across the room at the wrong moment. And in the space of a heartbeat, he sees her. Sitting alone near the back wall. Gray sweater. A worn paperback open beside her dinner plate. Completely unbothered. Completely in her own world. Not performing for anyone. Not trying to be seen or assessed or included. Just sitting there, eating her dinner, turning a page. And something about that, something about her absolute stillness, her quiet self-sufficiency, her complete indifference to the room around her, hits under his skin in a way he does not examine and does not try to understand. So he decides to make her part of his show. He decides to use her. And what follows is the kind of public cruelty that happens when a powerful man mistakes an audience for permission. His voice carries across the restaurant. People turn. Some laugh. Some don't. And then he picks up his phone, slides it across the white linen toward her with a smirk that has probably never failed him before, and says, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Go ahead, sweetheart. Call whoever you want." The table erupts. The room shifts. And the woman, calm, unhurried, spine straight, eyes steady, picks up the phone. She dials. It rings twice. Someone answers. And in the space of 90 seconds, the most powerful man in that restaurant becomes the smallest. His face changes. His body changes. The laughter at his table stops like a door closing. And the three investors sitting across from him begin to understand, slowly and with a growing unease that none of them will shake for weeks, that they have just watched their prospective business partner make the most expensive mistake of his professional life. This is the story of what actually happened that night, and what happened in the 14 months that followed, and what it means for every single one of us who has ever been sorted by someone who looked at us and decided, in the space of a glance, that we didn't count. Stay with me. Because this goes so much deeper than one night in a restaurant. And the ending will stay with you long after this video is over. Before we go any further into this story, we want to pause right here and hear from you. Drop a comment below right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We have people joining us from all over, and knowing who is in the room with us for a story like this one genuinely matters to us. And if you are new here and you have not yet subscribed, please click that button right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what we bring you next. The stories on this channel are about real moments, real people, and the kinds of truths that only reveal themselves slowly, over years, over choices, over the accumulation of small decisions that end up defining who we actually are. You do not want to miss them. Subscribe. And now let's go all the way back to the beginning. Because to understand the full weight of what happened between these two people on the night of October 14th, you have to understand who they were long before that restaurant, long before that phone, long before any of this. And the further back you go, the more clearly you can see that what happened that night was not an accident. It was an inevitability. It was two very different ways of moving through the world, arriving at the same table and finally, being forced to look at each other directly. His name was Douglas Merritt. He was 53 years old. A commercial real estate developer operating out of Charlotte, North Carolina, with a company he had built himself from a single property purchase in his late 20s into a portfolio that, by the autumn of the year we are talking about, was valued at somewhere between $40 and $60 million depending on the market quarter and the method of appraisal. If you had met Douglas in a boardroom, and a great many people had met Douglas in boardrooms, you would have understood immediately why he generated the kind of reactions he did. People admired him. People feared him. And most people, if they were honest, did a little of both simultaneously because he had built his career on making those two things feel inseparable. He was tall and sharp-dressed, and he spoke with the kind of controlled, calibrated confidence that made younger men feel like they needed to prove something and made older men feel like they needed to be careful. He filled space when he walked into it. He altered the energy of rooms. He was, in every sense that the world he had built for himself recognized and rewarded, a man who had made it. But to understand Douglas Merritt fully, to understand how a man that successful and that strategically intelligent could do something so profoundly stupid on an October Thursday at Hargrove's restaurant, you have to go back further than the portfolio and the reputation and the name on the buildings. You have to go back to a 3-bedroom house in a comfortable but modest neighborhood in South Carolina in the mid-1970s, where a boy grew up watching his father leave for work in the same reliable car for 22 years and his mother grade papers at the kitchen table after dinner, and understanding from a very early age that the world had categories. That some people were in one category and some people were in another, and that the distance between them was real and measurable, and this was the crucial part, the part that lodged itself so deeply in Douglas that it became structural, crossable. The distance was crossable if you wanted it badly enough and worked hard enough, and never, ever let anyone mistake you for the category you started in. He left South Carolina at 18 and never went back in any meaningful way. College was a state university, paid for partly by scholarship and partly by loans he paid off within 4 years of graduation, because carrying debt felt, to Douglas, like being followed by something he could not control. He chose business as his field of study with the same deliberateness that would characterize every major decision of his adult life, not because he was passionate about business theory but because he understood that the language of business was the language power spoke in the world he intended to occupy, and he intended to become fluent in it as quickly as possible. He graduated, took a job at a commercial property management company in Charlotte, worked there for 3 years learning the operational architecture of real estate from the inside, and then left to make his first purchase at age 28 with money borrowed from his father and a certainty about where the neighborhood was going that his father did not share but trusted Douglas enough to finance anyway. He was right about the neighborhood. He was almost always right about the neighborhoods. And being right, consistently and profitably, over a span of 2+ decades does something to a person's relationship with their own judgment. It makes it very hard to maintain a genuine awareness of the difference between being good at assessing property and being good at assessing people. Those are two entirely different skills. But they can feel, from the inside, exactly the same. The habit that Patricia noticed, the sorting habit, the quiet and constant ranking of the people around him, had not arrived all at once. It had accumulated the way most character flaws accumulate in people whose success has been real and sustained, gradually, invisibly, enabled by the fact that nobody around you has sufficient standing or incentive to point it out. A junior employee who gets a slightly too long pause before Douglas acknowledges them in a hallway does not confront Douglas about it. They absorb it. They learn from it. They adjust their behavior to try to move from one category to another in Douglas's invisible taxonomy of who counts. A waiter who feels the particular quality of being looked through rather than looked at when Douglas addresses him does not say anything. He does his job and hopes for a decent tip. A business associate who notices the dismissive half-smile when the conversation moves to someone's modest vacation or modest vehicle or modest neighborhood does not mention it, because Douglas is valuable and the cost of the observation outweighs the cost of the discomfort. And so the habit grows, unchallenged, until it becomes something the person doesn't even recognize as a habit anymore. Until it becomes, in their own internal accounting, simply how things are. How people are. What they're worth. Douglas Merritt had arrived at that point several years before October 14. Patricia, who watched him more closely than anyone, had understood this. She had said to a colleague once, quietly and carefully, in the particular way that people speak when they are saying something irreversible about someone powerful, "Douglas doesn't hate people. He just doesn't think most of them count." That sentence explains the dinner at Hargrove's more completely than anything else I could offer you. The dinner itself had been months in the making. The development project Douglas was pursuing, a large mixed-use corridor project in a transitional neighborhood of Charlotte, was the kind of deal that comes along every several years for a developer of Douglas's scale. Big enough to substantially expand his portfolio. Visible enough to cement his reputation in the Charlotte market for another decade. Complex enough to require institutional capital that he couldn't source independently. He had identified Meridian Capital Partners, an Atlanta-based investment group, as his target partner 8 months before the October dinner. He had spent those 8 months building the relationship with Gerald Hutchins, the group's Southeast portfolio manager, through a careful sequence of introductions, conversations, site visits, and preliminary financial presentations. He had hired a consultant to help him prepare materials. He had done a competitive analysis of the 2 other developer finalists. He had, in the final 3 weeks before the dinner, rehearsed his talking points with Patricia until she could have delivered them herself. The dinner at Hargrove's was the culmination of all of that. It was the closing performance. And Douglas Merritt, who had spent 30 years making rooms work for him, had every reason to believe it would work. He had reserved the corner table at Hargrove's 6 weeks in advance. He had selected the wine personally, a California Cabernet he knew Gerald Hutchins had mentioned appreciating at a dinner 2 months earlier, a detail Douglas had written down that same day in the small notebook he kept for exactly these kinds of things. He arrived 15 minutes early and walked the room once before sitting, the way he always did, to understand the space and ensure his table was everything he had arranged for it to be. The lighting was right. The spacing was right. The ambient noise level was appropriate, present enough to provide privacy, quiet enough to allow conversation without effort. Douglas Merritt sat at that corner table at 6:45 on a Thursday night in October and felt, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has controlled every variable he could identify, that the evening was going to go exactly as planned. And it did. Until it didn't. Until a young woman sat down near the back wall with a paperback and a plate of salmon and was simply, quietly, entirely herself. And Douglas Merritt looked at her and made the worst decision of his professional life without understanding that he was making a decision at all. Her name was Claire Ashworth. She was 31 years old. And to say that her life was different from Douglas Merritt's would be accurate but insufficient, because the word different doesn't capture the specific nature of the difference. It wasn't just circumstance that separated them. It was orientation. The way you face the world. The thing you are trying to accomplish when you walk into a room. Douglas walked into rooms to be seen. Claire walked into rooms to see. And those 2 fundamentally different postures produce fundamentally different human beings over 31 years of consistent practice. She had grown up in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a small second-floor apartment that her mother, Sandra Ashworth, kept with a meticulous care that was partly practical and partly, Claire understood as she got older, a form of dignity. Sandra was a nurse. She worked at a regional medical center for 22 years, the last 12 of them as a charge nurse in the cardiac unit, which meant that she managed other nurses while also caring for patients whose conditions were serious enough to require the highest level of floor-based attention the hospital could provide. She worked double shifts when the unit was short-staffed, which was often. She drove a 12-year-old Buick with a heating system that worked intermittently and a passenger side window that had to be held up manually in cold weather. She bought books for Claire at library sales and church rummage events and the occasional discount table outside a bookstore downtown, and she stacked them on a shelf in Claire's room with the same care and intention that some parents apply to video game collections or sports equipment. She told Claire things that mothers tell daughters, about the world, about how to move through it, about what to expect from it and what to refuse from it. But the thing she told her most consistently, the thing Claire can still hear in Sandra's voice if she closes her eyes and tries, was this: the strongest people in the room are almost always the ones you don't hear coming. Claire heard that sentence for the first time when she was 9 years old. The context was a school event, a science fair, held in the gymnasium of her elementary school, where a boy from the grade above her had won first place with a project that Claire, even at 9, understood had been built primarily by the boy's father. The boy's father was a civil engineer. The project was a detailed model of a water treatment facility with working parts. It was impressive. It was also, Claire felt with a certainty she could not yet fully articulate, not the boy's work. The project she had built herself, a comparative analysis of plant growth under different light conditions, with hand-drawn graphs and a typed report she had produced on the family's shared computer, had placed third. The judges had been kind. They had said excellent work in good detail and very clear presentation. And then they had handed the ribbon to the boy with the civil engineer father and the working water treatment model. Claire had been quiet on the ride home. Sandra had watched her in the rearview mirror. She had not asked what Claire was thinking. She had waited. And then, when they were back in the apartment and Claire was sitting at the kitchen table still holding her third-place ribbon and still being quiet, Sandra had sat down across from her and said it for the first time. The strongest people in the room are almost always the ones you don't hear coming. Claire had looked at the ribbon for a long moment. Then she had looked at her mother. And Sandra had said, not because of what they won. Because of who they were when they walked out. Claire had thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it the night she sat at a corner table in Hargrove's restaurant and a man slid his phone across white linen and told her to call whoever she wanted. She heard that sentence for the last time while she was studying for the bar exam, when Sandra called on a Sunday afternoon and asked how the studying was going and then, as the conversation was winding down, said it again, not as advice, not as instruction, just as a kind of benediction. As a way of saying, I see what you are. I have always seen what you are. Keep going. Claire kept going. She was an exceptional student without ever being the student who needed to announce that she was exceptional. Her teachers noticed the quality of her thinking before they noticed her grades, which was unusual. Usually it happened the other way around. Her third-grade teacher wrote in a report card, in the handwritten comments section that most teachers filled with vague generalities, something specific, Claire processes before she responds. This is rarer than it sounds. It will serve her well. Her middle school English teacher told Sandra at a parent conference that Claire's written work had a quality she struggled to name exactly, and then named it anyway. She understands that every sentence is a choice. Her high school history teacher submitted one of Claire's research papers to a state academic competition without telling her. Claire found out when she placed second and received a certificate in the mail that she initially thought was junk and almost threw away. She was not, in any of these years, trying to be noticed. She was trying to understand things. The noticing was a byproduct. She graduated near the top of her high school class in Greensboro. She won a partial scholarship to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The scholarship was merit-based and covered just over half her costs, with the rest managed through a combination of student loans, work-study hours in the university's administrative offices, and Sandra's contributions from her nursing salary, which Sandra gave without being asked and without discussing the sacrifice involved because Sandra Ashworth did not make a performance of sacrifice. She simply made it. Claire graduated in 3.5 years, not because she was trying to be efficient but because she kept taking more credits than she needed because the material kept being interesting and she saw no reason to slow down when the thing in front of her was worth moving toward. She studied political science and legal studies. She wrote papers that made professors share them with colleagues. She sat in seminars and said less than most people in the room and was remembered more clearly than nearly all of them. She had a professor in her junior year, a constitutional law scholar named Dr. Ellison, a woman in her 60s who had clerked for a federal appellate judge and then spent 20 years in academia without ever losing the particular precision of someone who had spent time in courtrooms where words had binding legal consequences, who told Claire after class one afternoon that she wrote like someone who understood that the reader's time was finite and that every word therefore had to justify its Presence. Most people, Dr. Ellison said, treat writing as a way of showing what they know. You treat it as a way of making sure the reader understands. Those are completely different objectives. Claire had thought about that distinction for years afterward. She was still thinking about it when she was preparing briefs at Graves, Whitmore and Associates. She left Chapel Hill in December of a year when most of her entering class was still a semester away from finishing and moved to Charlotte, which she had chosen because the city was growing and she wanted to be somewhere that was becoming something rather than somewhere that had already decided what it was. She applied to 12 positions. She heard back from 4. She interviewed with 3. She accepted the offer from Graves, Whitmore and Associates because of one conversation that lasted 45 minutes and happened, unusually, with the senior partner himself. Nathaniel Graves had a habit, unusual for a man of his professional standing, of interviewing candidates for entry-level positions personally when something in their application caught his attention. What caught his attention in Claire's application was a writing sample she had submitted. It was a legal analysis she had written as part of a class project during her final semester at Chapel Hill, an examination of a corporate liability case that had recently been decided in the Fourth Circuit. Nathaniel had read it on a Thursday evening in his office and then read it again on Friday morning. Then he had called his hiring manager and said, "The Ashworth candidate. Schedule her with me directly." The conversation that followed covered the case she had written about, the arguments she had made, the ones she hadn't made and why she had chosen to leave them out, what she thought the dissent had gotten right, what she thought everyone had gotten wrong. Nathaniel asked the questions and Claire answered them, and then she asked questions back, which most entry-level candidates did not do, and Nathaniel answered those too. When it was over, Nathaniel called her the next day and offered her the position at 10% above the advertised salary. He told her 2 things, that he expected a great deal from the people who worked with him, and that he paid attention. He said that those 2 things tended to work out well together. Claire said she would be there Monday. She was. 6 years is a long time to be somewhere. Long enough to understand it from the inside. Long enough for the place to understand you in return. Claire became, over those 6 years, the person at Graves, Whitmore and Associates who other people brought the hard problems to, not the senior attorneys, who had their own channels and their own hierarchies, but the paralegals and junior associates who had a question that needed a specific kind of thinking and knew, from experience, that Claire was the one most likely to find the angle that nobody else had seen yet. She was meticulous with documents. She remembered case details that colleagues had to look up. She caught errors that others missed, not with self-congratulatory energy, but with the quiet competence of someone who simply could not pass a mistake without correcting it because allowing it to pass felt like a form of carelessness her upbringing had made impossible. She had an instinct for the emotional architecture of a legal dispute, for what each party actually needed beneath what they were formally asking for, that Nathaniel Graves had described to 2 partners, in separate conversations, as rarer than any specific legal knowledge and genuinely impossible to teach. She was also, by the time of October 14th, 14 months away from sitting for the bar exam. She had been in night law school for 3 years, attending classes 2 evenings a week and on Saturday mornings, studying in the margins of her days, on lunch breaks, in the 40 minutes between arriving home and needing to sleep. She was moving steadily toward it. Not sprinting, not grinding in any way that announced itself as suffering, but moving with the consistent, patient, sustainable momentum of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has done the math on how long it will take and has accepted that timeline without drama. She had enrolled in the night program for reasons both practical and deeply personal, because she needed the income the firm provided, and because she had understood from an early age that the law was not just a career. It was the instrument by which the world she had grown up in could be argued with, challenged, made to account for itself. She was going to be very good at this. She had always known it. And neither the gray sweater nor the Honda Civic nor a man in a charcoal suit at the best table in any restaurant in Charlotte had ever had the slightest effect on that knowledge. She had not planned to be at Hargrove's on October 14th. Nathaniel had called at 5:30 that afternoon. She was reviewing a contract brief that needed to be ready by morning, and asked if she could do him a favor. A client named Franklin Cross was having dinner at Hargrove's and had requested that signed originals of a document be delivered to him there rather than waiting until the next morning's office hours. Claire said of course. She picked up the folder from Nathaniel's assistant, finished the brief she was working on, and drove the 3 blocks to Hargrove's. The hostess checked for Franklin Cross and then looked up with the expression of someone delivering minor but genuine bad news. Mr. Cross had been in earlier, had apparently had a scheduling misunderstanding about the time, and had already left for the evening. Claire could leave the documents at the host's stand if she liked. She stood at the hostess stand for a moment. It was 7:20. She had not eaten since a granola bar at 12:15. The restaurant smelled of warm bread and rosemary and something caramelized that she couldn't immediately identify. A soft piano piece moved through the room from speakers she couldn't locate. She thought about the leftover pasta in her refrigerator and the contracts she still needed to review and the chapter of civil procedure she had planned to read before bed. And then something small and human and entirely reasonable happened. She decided to eat a real meal first. She asked the hostess for a table for one. She was seated near the back wall, at a 2-person table with a slight separation from the larger main dining room, close enough to feel part of the evening, private enough to feel her own quiet. She ordered the salmon. A glass of sparkling water. Roasted vegetables. She took her worn paperback out of her bag, a John Grisham novel she had been working through for 2 weeks and finally making real progress on, and she opened it to chapter 5 and began to read. She was not bothering a single living person. She was just there, being entirely herself, in the particular way that people who have always known who they are tend to be themselves, without performance, without announcement, without any awareness that it might be remarkable. It was not remarkable to Claire. It was just Thursday. She had been there for approximately 20 minutes when Douglas Merritt noticed her. The waiter's mistake was innocent and unremarkable. He picked up the wrong check presenter from the service station and placed it on the nearest large table, which was Douglas's corner table, instead of the smaller table to its left. Douglas glanced at it automatically. Salmon. Sparkling water. Roasted vegetables. $42 before tip. He looked up to find the table it belonged to. He found Claire. Gray sweater. Paperback open. Completely unbothered. And in the space of the few seconds he spent looking at her, Douglas Merritt processed a set of signals: the plain clothes, the single table, the modest bill, the used paperback, the utter absence of any social performance, and sorted her. Filed her. Placed her, with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this for 30 years, into the category he had already prepared. And then, with 3 investors watching and the particular momentum of a performance already in progress, he let that sorting become audible. Looks like someone snuck in and ordered above their budget tonight. The laughter came. Claire looked up. And the calm she offered him in response, the steady, settled, entirely untroubled calm of a person who has heard versions of this assessment before and has long since stopped needing to respond to it, that calm was the thing that Douglas Merritt could not read and could not tolerate in equal measure. He continued. Louder, now. More specific. Comments about what she wore and what she probably did for work and what her budget probably looked like and what kinds of places were really meant for people like her. Each sentence was casual. Each one was devastating in the particular way that public humiliation is devastating, not because it reveals truth but because it makes the room complicit in a lie. And through all of it, Claire Ashworth sat still. Her spine was straight. Her hands were relaxed on the table. She had closed the paperback, placing it face down to hold her page, and she was looking at Douglas with the expression of someone who has decided, clearly and without visible effort, not to give him what he is looking for. Not the flinch. Not the flush. Not the gathering of belongings and the hurried departure that would confirm the story he was telling the room about who she was. She just sat there, present and composed, waiting for whatever this was to finish. And the longer she sat that way, the more visible it became to anyone paying attention, and some people were paying attention, that the person being revealed in this exchange was not Claire. It was Douglas. He was the one performing. He was the one who needed the room's confirmation. He was the one for whom this moment was necessary. She was just eating her dinner. He picked up his phone with a theatrical gesture that the room registered even if nobody acknowledged it, and he slid it across the white linen toward her. "Go ahead," he said. "Call whoever you want. Have them come explain to me why you belong here." And in that moment, Douglas Merritt, who had spent 30 years preparing rooms, controlling variables, rehearsing performances, made his one true miscalculation. He offered her a tool. He handed her the means of the thing he did not see coming. Because Douglas had sorted Claire so completely, so thoroughly, so efficiently, that it had not occurred to him, not for a single second, that the number in her memory might be one that meant something in his world. He had looked at the gray sweater and the $42 bill and the worn paperback, and he had filed her so far from his category of relevant that the idea of real consequence simply did not compute. He thought it was theater. He thought the phone call she was about to make would be to a friend, a boyfriend, a family member who would either not answer or answer and be unable to do anything about anything. He thought this was going to end with her retreating and him turning back to his investors with the quiet satisfaction of a demonstration completed. He thought he knew what he was dealing with. He was so wrong that the distance between what he thought and what was actually true had a physical dimension. You could see it closing in real time in the 90 seconds that followed. Claire said, "Okay." Just that word. Then she picked up the phone. She did not scroll or search. She dialed from memory, the way you dial the numbers you have called hundreds of times, the numbers your hands know before your mind has finished formulating the intention. It rang once. It rang twice. The voice that answered was calm and low and carried the specific quality of authority that comes not from volume but from decades of precision. Claire said, "Hey. It's me. I'm sorry to call this late. I'm at Hargrove's. There's someone here who seems to want to know whether I belong." A pause. 4 seconds, maybe 5. And then, "Put him on." Claire extended the phone across the linen. She looked at Douglas steadily and said, "He'd like to speak with you." Douglas took the phone. He was still performing, still in character, still managing the scene. He had told himself this would be a brief and confirming exchange that ended with him back in control. He said, "Hello." And then it began to arrive. The understanding. The cold, complete, cellular understanding. It did not come all at once. It came in pieces, the way the picture in a photograph develops, first the broad shapes, then the details, then the thing you didn't expect to see. By the 4th second the smile was gone. By the 12th second his posture had contracted from open and expansive to careful and contained. By the 30th second the color had left his face. By the 60th second Paul Reeves, sitting across from him, had stopped looking away. And Douglas said, in the voice of a man who has had the floor changed beneath him, "Yes, sir." And, "No. I didn't know." And, after a silence long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone at the table, "I understand." "Yes. I'm sorry." He ended the call. He set the phone on the table between them. He did not slide it back. He left it there, between them, as though it had become evidence of something he didn't know how to handle. And the room was quiet. Genuinely, specifically quiet, not the managed ambient quiet of before, but the particular silence that descends when something real has happened and everyone in the vicinity has felt it and nobody has figured out yet what to do with what they feel. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this story all the way through. Because what I am about to tell you, what was said on that phone call, who was on the other end of it, and what happened in the 2 weeks that followed, goes so much further than one man's embarrassment. It goes to the heart of something that I believe every single person watching this has experienced in some form. So stay with me. Stay with me and I promise you, this is where the story earns everything it has been building toward. The man on the other end of that call was Nathaniel Graves. 64 years old. Senior partner at Graves, Whitmore and Associates. The man who had read a 22-year-old's legal analysis on a Thursday evening and read it again on a Friday morning and then called his hiring manager and said bring her in personally. But to understand why 4 words from Nathaniel Graves, just 4 words, put him on, could drain the blood from a man like Douglas Merritt's face in the span of seconds, you have to understand who Nathaniel Graves actually was. Not the title. The person. The professional history. The specific, concrete, real-world weight of the name. Nathaniel Graves had been a federal prosecutor for 18 years before moving to private practice. He had tried cases in 4 federal districts across the Southeast. He had been involved in prosecutions that produced precedent-setting rulings on corporate liability and financial fraud that were still being cited in courtrooms the year we are talking about. During a 3-year period in the mid-2000s, he had served as one of the lead prosecutors in a multi-state real estate fraud case, a case involving 11 defendants, fraudulent transactions across 6 states, and the recovery of over $200 million in funds that had been obtained through a scheme so elaborate that the investigation had required a joint task force of 4 federal agencies. That case had produced a conviction rate that generated coverage in 3 national legal publications and a career reputation that was specific, lasting, and entirely earned. He was not famous the way celebrities are famous. But in the world of high-stakes commercial real estate law in the Southeast United States, Nathaniel Graves was a name that operated differently than most names. It was a name that made rooms quiet when it was mentioned. It was a name that made other attorneys check their work twice. It was a name that made institutional investors feel, when they heard it attached to their legal representation, that they were covered in the specific way that only comes from someone who has spent 3 decades understanding exactly what can go wrong and why. In private practice, Nathaniel had focused on complex commercial litigation and high-value transactional work. He represented institutions rather than individuals, investment groups, development funds, financial entities whose assets were large enough to justify the stakes of any given piece of litigation or advice. His client list was not long. It did not need to be. In the previous 3 years, he had served as lead legal counsel for 3 of the largest commercial real estate investment transactions that had closed in the Charlotte market. He had, at the time of October 14, been retained by Meridian Capital Partners as their primary legal advisor for Southeast operations for a period of 2 years. Meridian Capital Partners. The investment group from Atlanta. The group represented that evening at Douglas Merritt's corner table at Hargroves by Gerald Hutchins, James Okafor, and Paul Reeves. The group whose $40 million development project Douglas had spent 8 months pursuing. The group Douglas had been performing for all evening with the tailored suit and the pre-selected wine and the rehearsed talking points about the comparable project on the West Side. Nathaniel Graves was their attorney. He had been in a meeting with Gerald Hutchins about the Charlotte project just 3 weeks before October 14. He had, in that meeting, mentioned Claire's name. He had told Gerald, in the offhand, factual way that Nathaniel communicated things that mattered to him, that she was the most capable person on his team and that he expected her to pass the bar on her first attempt and that when she did, she was going to be someone Charlotte's legal community would come to know well. Gerald Hutchins had filed that away. And then a Thursday evening and a phone call and 4 words brought it roaring back. Douglas had known the name Nathaniel Graves for years. He had tried twice, through intermediaries, to bring Graves' firm on as legal counsel for his own major development projects. The first approach had been made approximately 3 years before October 14. The second had come 8 months later. Both times, Nathaniel had declined through his assistant, politely and with no explanation attached. Douglas had absorbed those rejections the way ambitious people absorb things that don't fit their preferred narrative. He had filed them under capacity constraints and moved on. He had not spent time wondering whether there might be another reason. He had not asked anyone who might know. He had not, in any serious way, tried to understand Nathaniel Graves' perspective on things. He had simply moved on to the next option. That incuriosity, that particular, expensive incuriosity about the inner lives and assessments of the people around him, was the same quality that had produced the evening at Hargroves. Both were expressions of the same fundamental failure, the failure to wonder, seriously and with genuine openness, about things that fell outside his already established understanding of how the world worked. On the phone, Nathaniel was brief. He was not heated. He did not threaten. He explained, clearly and without embellishment, that Claire Ashworth had worked with him for 6 years and was someone he held in the highest professional regard. He said that what Douglas had done that evening, loudly, publicly, and in front of witnesses, was something he was going to give serious thought to. He said that the people at Douglas's table were clients of his firm and that he would naturally be in conversation with them in the coming days, as he routinely was, and that it would be difficult in the course of those conversations to avoid the subject of the evening. Not as a complaint. Not as a formal action. Simply as the natural flow of a professional relationship in which honesty was a baseline expectation. And then he said the sentence. The one Douglas would return to many times in the months that followed, alone in his car or early in the morning before the day's demands arrived, the one that landed differently every time he came back to it. He said, "A man who mocks a woman eating alone has already shown you exactly how he'll behave when the deal gets hard." Then the line went quiet. And Douglas Merritt sat at the best table in the room in a restaurant full of people who had just watched the most expensive 90 seconds of his career, and he held the phone in his hand, and he understood, with a clarity that all his professional success had never quite produced in him before, exactly who he was and exactly what that had cost him. Claire finished her dinner. This is the part of the story that people who hear it tend to focus on, and I think they're right to, because it is the part that reveals the most about who she actually was. She did not gather her things in a hurry. She did not leave before her plate was clear. She ate her salmon, which was still warm. She drank the last of her sparkling water. She allowed herself the remaining minutes of the meal she had decided to have, calmly and without drama, because she had come to eat dinner and she was going to eat dinner, and the fact that a stranger had chosen to involve her in his performance did not obligate her to sacrifice the meal she had ordered and paid for. When she was finished, she reached for the check presenter. She placed cash inside, the exact amount, and a tip that was, the server would tell a colleague the following day, more generous than most tables at twice the price and 3 times the party size. Because Claire had watched the server navigate the evening with visible discomfort, the young woman had gone pale during Douglas's comments and had mouthed something that looked like, "I'm sorry," from across the room during the worst of it, and Claire understood that the server had done nothing wrong and deserved to be treated accordingly. She put on her coat. She picked up her paperback, the document folder still in her bag. She stood. And before she turned toward the door, she looked at Douglas Merritt. Directly. The way she had looked at him throughout the evening, without heat, without performance, without the need for him to understand anything in order for what she felt to be real. And she said, "For what it's worth, the salmon was excellent." Then she walked through the dining room and out the door into the cool October night. The door swung closed behind her. The piano music continued. The room remained quiet for what felt, to the people in it, like much longer than it probably was. Gerald Hutchins was awake by 5:30 the following morning. He had not slept well, the kind of not sleeping that comes from an evening that keeps replaying behind your eyes in the dark, arranging and rearranging itself into different framings that all arrive at the same conclusion. He was on his second cup of coffee when his phone rang at 8:15. He saw the name. He picked up. The call with Nathaniel Graves lasted 23 minutes. Nathaniel described what had been reported to him. He was factual and unhurried. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. Gerald asked 3 questions. Nathaniel answered them precisely. Then there was a brief silence, and Gerald said, "I appreciate you calling." And Nathaniel said, "Of course." And that was the entire call. But in those 23 minutes and 3 questions and 1 brief silence, the $40 million project that Douglas Merritt had spent 8 months preparing for moved from probable to impossible. Not loudly. Not with confrontation or recrimination or any of the visible markers of a deal falling apart. Just quietly, the way certain conclusions reach themselves once all the relevant information has been laid out plainly in good light. Gerald spoke to James Okafor at 10 o'clock that morning. James had not slept particularly well either. He was a careful man by temperament, a former commercial banker who had built his career on the practice of examining the assumptions beneath the numbers before committing to what the numbers seemed to say. And the assumption he had been examining since approximately 11 o'clock the previous evening, lying in his hotel room with the news channel on mute and the ceiling doing nothing useful, was whether Douglas Merritt was the kind of man you could trust to represent your investment in a city you didn't live in a project that would take 3 years to complete, with partners and contractors and city officials and community stakeholders who would all form opinions about what kind of person stood behind whatever Meridian's name was attached to. James had laughed at one of Douglas's comments at the table. He had laughed before he understood what he was doing, and the realization of that he had provided social endorsement to a cruelty because the man delivering it had money and he was there to do business with him, had been sitting in his chest since the moment the laughter left him like something he hadn't meant to drop. He told Gerald, when Gerald called, "I don't think this works. And I want to be honest that I'm saying that partly because of what I did at that table and what I should have done instead. I don't want to benefit from a partnership I should have challenged on the spot." Gerald had not expected that level of honesty and found, when he heard it, that it clarified something for him too. Gerald spoke to Paul Reeves at 11:15. Paul had already sent a memo. It was 3 paragraphs long. The final paragraph read, "The fundamental question for any long-term development partnership is not whether the partner can execute the project as planned. It is how they will behave when circumstances do not go as planned. Last night provided direct evidence about that question. I believe we are obligated to take it seriously." Gerald forwarded the memo to the investment committee in Atlanta with one added sentence, "I agree with Paul's assessment entirely." The committee responded within the business day. The decision was unanimous. 2 weeks after the dinner at Hargroves, Douglas Merritt's office received a formally worded 4-sentence notification from Meridian Capital Partners. The investment group had decided to proceed with the Charlotte development project through a different partner. It wished Douglas and his company well. There was no additional explanation. There was no offer of a follow-up conversation. Douglas read the letter 3 times. He had his assistant place a call to Gerald Hutchins's office. The response came through an administrator. The decision had been made at the committee level and was final. Douglas sat at his desk for a long time after that. He was not a man accustomed to extended stillness. His success had been built partly on the ability to process setbacks quickly and redirect his energy without losing momentum. But this one did not process. It sat in him differently than a lost bid or a deal that had gone to a better positioned competitor through no fault of his own. Because he knew exactly what had happened and exactly why. And the knowledge of that, the clear, unobstructed, impossible to rationalize away knowledge of his own role in the outcome, was a different kind of weight than he had carried before. It was the weight of seeing yourself accurately. And for a man who had spent 30 years building a carefully managed image of himself, accurate seeing was the most disorienting experience available. Patricia noticed the change before he said anything, because Patricia always noticed things before anyone said anything. It was what made her invaluable, this particular attentiveness, this ability to read the room that he occupied and track the subtle shifts in it that nobody else was looking for. It showed up first in small ways. A slightly longer pause before he spoke in situations where he would previously have been immediate. A willingness to ask questions in contexts where he would previously have supplied conclusions. A new habit of staying after meetings for brief individual conversations with people who had contributed ideas he would previously have absorbed and moved past without acknowledgement. He stopped making the comments, the small, casual, apparently offhand assessments about the categories of people around him, that had been so consistent a feature of his professional manner for so long that his team had absorbed them as background noise, the way you absorb the sound of the air conditioning, always there, never noticed, missed only when it stops. And it stopped. Completely. Not gradually or partially. It stopped as though someone had turned it off. Patricia noticed the first week it was absent and noted it privately, the way she noted everything. She noted it for 2 weeks without mentioning it. By the third week she told the colleague she trusted most, something happened. I don't know what. But something cracked. And I think what came out needed to come out a long time ago. At a construction site walkthrough in November, he stopped to introduce himself personally to the site foreman's assistant, a young man named Kevin who had been on the project for 3 months and in that entire time had never been directly addressed by Douglas Merritt. Kevin would later tell his girlfriend about it that evening, slightly confused, slightly moved, not sure how to categorize the experience of being seen by someone who had previously appeared not to register his existence. At the company holiday dinner in December, Douglas spoke individually to every member of the catering staff. Not performatively. Not with the practiced gracious employer energy of someone who has decided that being seen to treat workers well is useful for his reputation. Just genuinely, the way you speak to people when you have recently discovered that they are, in fact, people and that this is a relevant fact. His operations manager, a man named Carl who had been with Douglas for 9 years and had therefore witnessed thousands of hours of the old version, mentioned this to his wife when he got home. She asked, "Is that good or bad?" Carl thought about it for a moment, for longer than he expected to, actually, because the question turned out to be more complicated than it appeared. Then he said, "It's good. I think it might be the best thing that's happened to him in years. I just wish whatever caused it had cost him less." It took 14 months. 14 months from October 14th, a Tuesday in December, cold and clear, the kind of Charlotte morning where the air has that particular sharpness that makes everything feel more defined than usual, when a check arrived by courier at Graves, Whitmore and Associates, made out to the firm's scholarship fund for first-generation law students. $25,000. No press release. No letter requesting acknowledgement or recognition. No communication requesting that anyone be told or thanked or informed. A handwritten note, brief and plain, that said, "No conditions." No recognition requested. Just an overdue correction. Signed with an initial. Nathaniel Graves' assistant brought it to him and placed it on his desk and said nothing because the note made it clear that nothing was the appropriate response. Nathaniel looked at it for a long moment, at the check, at the note, at the single letter that stood in for the full name, at the phrase, "overdue correction," that was the most honest thing, he suspected, that Douglas Merritt had written in a very long time. He held it for a moment. Then he folded the note carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, in the back, behind other things, where it would not be casually visible. He put the check through the appropriate channels. He told no one. He would not tell Claire. He would not mention the note to his partners or his assistant or anyone else who might be inclined to find it meaningful. Because Nathaniel Graves understood something that most people in positions of power struggle to resist understanding, that some gestures belong entirely to the person making them. That they lose something essential, something true and private and necessary, the moment they are witnessed and translated into a story about the witness's generosity and transformation. The donation was Douglas's. The note was Douglas's. The overdue correction was Douglas's. And it needed to stay that way in order to mean what it could mean. Which is, in the end, the only kind of correction that ever really holds, the one made in private, for no audience, with no applause available, because the person making it has finally understood that the audience was never the point. Claire passed the North Carolina bar examination on a Tuesday in February, 14 months after the night at Hargroves. The results were released online, through a state bar portal, at 9 in the morning. Claire had known the release date for 6 weeks. She had told herself she would check at lunch, that she would do her morning work first, attend to what needed attending to, and check when she had a natural break. She lasted until 8:57. She opened the portal with her door closed and her coffee still hot in her hands, she noticed with a certain detachment, not entirely steady. She sat very still for approximately 20 seconds after the result loaded on the screen. The word was there. She read it twice. Then she closed the laptop. She opened it again and read it a third time. Then she sat quietly for another moment with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes closed. Not performing the moment. Not preparing a response to it. Just being in it, fully, the way she had learned from her mother to be fully in things rather than racing past them toward whatever came next. Then she picked up her phone. She called her mother. Sandra Ashworth was in the break room of the cardiac unit between shifts, sitting with a cup of tea and a cafeteria yogurt she had been eating slowly for 20 minutes while reading a paperback mystery. She had developed the reading habit somewhere in her 40s, after years of being too tired at the end of shifts to do anything but sleep, and had worked her way through several hundred novels in the decades since. Her phone rang with Claire's name on the screen. She put down the yogurt. She picked up. And Claire told her. In one sentence. Straightforward and clear, the way Claire said everything. And Sandra Ashworth, charge nurse in the cardiac unit for 12 years, a woman who had witnessed births and deaths and every variant of human extremity that a hospital contains, and who had spent 22 years of her adult life arranging her own needs around what her daughter needed to become, Sandra made a sound. A sound that Claire later described to a close friend as, every double shift and library sale book and happy tear she ever invested in me, arriving all at once. They stayed on the phone for 11 minutes. They did not say much that was translatable into report. They did not need to. Some conversations are not about the words. They are about the years behind the words. They are about the third-grade report card and the partial scholarship and the fast food eaten in a car on the way to night class and the hours of studying in the 40-minute window before sleep. They are about a particular sentence said for the first time when a girl was 9 years old, holding a third-place ribbon, and said for the last time on a Sunday afternoon while the girl was studying for the exam whose results she was now reporting. Sandra Ashworth had never doubted the outcome of this call. But hearing it anyway, hearing it in her daughter's voice, quiet and steady and real, was a different kind of knowing than the knowing that has always been there. It was the knowing that arrives. And it was worth every year of waiting for. Nathaniel was the second person Claire told. She walked to his office, knocked on the open door, and stood in the doorway. He looked up from his desk. She said, "I passed." And he looked at her, with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years building things and knows the particular quality of satisfaction that comes when something you invested in early, before the proof existed, becomes exactly what you believed it would become, and he stood up and walked around his desk and shook her hand with both of his and said, "I know." She said, "You knew before I called." And he said, "I knew the first time we spoke." The rest of it was just time catching up. He had her bar admission certificate framed before her first official day as an associate attorney. He placed it in the main conference room, not the hallway, not a side office, but the room where the firm's most significant meetings happened, where clients sat across from counsel and decisions with real stakes were made. It hung between a copy of the firm's founding charter and a photograph of Charlotte taken from the roof of a building the firm had helped a client negotiate 20 years earlier. When people asked Nathaniel about it, he said simply, "She earned it." Which was the most accurate and also the most complete sentence available. On Claire's first day as an associate attorney, a small cluster of colleagues gathered in the conference room to look at the certificate in its frame. Someone who had joined the firm 6 months earlier and didn't know the full story asked how Nathaniel had originally identified her, how someone of his standing had ended up hiring a 22-year-old with no legal credentials and then invested in her so completely for 6 years. The person standing nearest to them was a paralegal named Marcus who had been at Hargrove's that October night, 2 tables away, having dinner with a client. Marcus thought about the question. Then he said, "She was sitting alone in a restaurant with a book. Someone decided to use her as a prop. And she handled it in a way that showed you exactly who she was, without raising her voice, without losing a single thing." Nathaniel saw it. He'd seen it before, honestly, he hired her before that night. But that night confirmed everything. Marcus paused. She was just being herself. Completely and quietly herself. And that was more than enough. There is a question at the center of this story that I want to spend real time with before we close, not a few sentences but genuine, unhurried time, because I think it is the most important question the story raises and the one most likely to outlast the hour after you finish watching it. The question is not about what happened to Douglas Merritt, though that matters. It is not even primarily about how Claire handled herself, though that matters enormously. The deeper question, the one that this story is actually about, underneath all the restaurants and phone calls and investment deals, is this: what do we do with the people in our lives who sort us? Who look at us, at our clothes or our cars, at our job titles or our lack of them, at the neighborhood we live in or the school we attended or the table we're sitting at alone with a paperback on a Thursday night, and make a decision, fast and final and entirely unchallenged, about what category we belong in and what we are therefore worth. Because Douglas Merritt is not a character in a story. He is a type. A recognizable, consistent, deeply human type that most of us have encountered in some form, in a workplace, in a family dinner conversation, in a school hallway, in a restaurant, in a meeting room, in the particular way certain people look through you rather than at you when you are introduced at a professional event. The man who mistakes visibility for value. Who confuses the performance of confidence with its actual substance. Who has been successful enough and unchallenged enough for long enough that the habit of ranking the people around him has calcified into something he no longer recognizes as a habit at all. He simply does it. The way you breathe. The way you check your phone. Without intention. Without awareness. Without any recognition that it is costing him something real every single time. And here is the uncomfortable part of that observation, the part one want you to sit with rather than move past quickly. Most of us have some version of this habit. Not Douglas's version, perhaps. Not the loud restaurant version with an audience and a slid phone and a public performance of contempt. Most of us are not that far along in the habit. But the habit itself, the quick assessment, the rapid categorization, the decision made before the evidence is in, lives in most of us to some degree. We do it with the person at the party who mentions their job and we immediately calculate their income and their education and their relevance to our world and file them accordingly, usually before the sentence is even finished. We do it on a first meeting, with the clothes and the handshake and the neighborhood somebody mentions they live in. We do it in comment sections and in conversations about mutual acquaintances and in the quiet of our own thoughts when we are deciding whose opinion to take seriously and whose to disregard. We do it quickly. We do it efficiently. And we almost never check our work. We almost never go back and look at the category we assigned someone and ask ourselves, was that accurate? Did I see them, or did I see what I expected to see? Did I understand them, or did I understand the shorthand I had already prepared for someone who looked like them? And the answer, if we are honest, is that we almost never check. Because the whole value of the sorting system, from the perspective of the person doing the sorting, is that it is fast. It saves time. It lets you move through the world without having to start from zero with every person you encounter. And it does save time. It is efficient. It is also, with a frequency that most of us would find disturbing if we totaled it up, wrong. And the cost of being wrong, the relationship not built, the perspective not heard, the person not seen, the opportunity not recognized, is almost always invisible. Because the person you sorted incorrectly usually doesn't get a Nathaniel Graves on the other end of a phone. They usually just absorb it quietly and move on. And you never know what you missed. You just carry on, sorting, efficient and wrong, accumulating a debt of unseeing that you never have to pay because nobody sends the bill. Douglas got the bill. He got it in the most visible and consequential way possible, a $40 million deal dissolved in 23 minutes over a morning phone call, conducted by a man who didn't need to raise his voice because the facts were sufficient. And that visibility, that clean, unmistakable chain of cause and consequence, is what made the story available to tell. But I want you to understand that the same thing happens, in quieter forms, all around you all the time. Managers who underestimate team members and lose them to competitors who saw what the manager missed. Mentors who choose protégés based on surface presentation and overlook the person in the corner who was watching and thinking and waiting for someone to look directly at them. Investors who back the polished pitch and miss the quiet founder who builds things that last. Friends who sort the people at the party and drive home with the same circle they arrived with, slightly smaller than they could have been. It is always happening. The cost is always real. It is almost never as visible as it was on October 14th at Hargroves. But the mechanism is always the same. You look at someone. You see what you expect. You stop there. And you never find out what was actually there. And here is what I want to ask you. Not rhetorically. Actually and directly, person to person, because I think you deserve the direct question and I think you're capable of the honest answer. Think about the last time someone sorted you. When someone looked at you and determined, before you opened your mouth or finished a sentence or had any real opportunity to demonstrate who you actually were, that you belonged in a particular category. Think about what that felt like in your body, not in your thoughts, but in your physical experience of that specific moment. The slight contraction in your chest. The breath that becomes a little careful. The way your hands find something to do so you have somewhere to put the energy of being seen incorrectly. The particular quality of holding yourself together in a room that has just decided something about you that isn't true. And then think about what you did. Because that is the question that determines everything about who you are in the process of becoming. Did you perform the retreat they were looking for? Did you make yourself smaller so the room would be more comfortable? Did you give them the flinch, the flush, the hurried departure, the apology you didn't owe, the reaction that confirmed their assessment and sent you home carrying the weight of having agreed to something false? Or did you do something else? Did you find some version of what Claire found, that still, composed, deliberate refusal to let someone else's insufficient understanding of you become the operating truth of the moment? Did you hold your dinner fork and finish your meal and look at the situation clearly enough to understand that the person across the table was not revealing something true about you? They were revealing something true about themselves. Because that is what Claire understood. That is what Sandra Ashworth's years of double shifts and library sale books and one particular sentence had given her daughter, the foundational, bone-deep, completely non-negotiable understanding that her value was not located in anyone else's assessment of it. It existed independently of whether the room saw it. It existed independently of whether Douglas Merritt or anyone like him ever paused long enough to look past the gray sweater and the $42 bill and the worn paperback to see what was actually sitting at that table. It had been real before he looked at her. It remained real after he chose not to see it. And it would still be real when she was standing in front of a conference room with her name on a bar certificate in a frame, and when she was arguing cases before judges who would lean forward slightly in their chairs, and when she was mentoring her own young colleagues years from now and telling them, maybe in her own version of Sandra's words, maybe in words she found herself, that the strongest people in the room are almost always the ones you don't hear coming. Her worth was hers. It had always been hers. And the most liberating thing about genuinely knowing that, the thing that produced the composure, the stillness, for what it's worth, the salmon was excellent, is that once you know it completely, nobody can take it from you. They can try to make you doubt it. They can be loud and expensive and backed by an audience. They can slide their phone across white linen and invite the room to laugh. And you can sit there, spine straight, fork in hand, and know something they don't, that this moment, whatever it is not the measure of you. It is the measure of them. And you are going to finish your dinner. Now I want to ask you something else. Something about the other side of this story. Think about the people in your life who have been Nathaniel Graves to you. The ones who saw you before you had the credentials. Who hired you before the evidence caught up to their confidence. Who said, in some form or another, explicitly or through the simple act of their investment, I see what this is going to be. Think about the teacher who kept your paper. The mentor who made the introduction. The parent who went without something so you could have access to something. The colleague who said your name in a room when you weren't in it. The person who forwarded your resume with a personal note. The person who believed you when you told them what you were trying to do, even when the doing was still mostly invisible. These people exist in most lives, if you are willing to look for them with honesty rather than cataloging only your difficulties. They are often quiet about what they have done. They often don't require acknowledgement of it. Nathaniel Graves framed that certificate and put it in the conference room and said, she earned it, and that was the entirety of the announcement. He did not need more than that. Because the investment had already been made. Because the outcome had already arrived. Because some things don't need announcing, they just need to exist, plainly and durably, in the spaces where people can see them. If someone has been that to you, and I hope someone has, I genuinely hope someone has, tell them. Not in a grand gesture. Not in a speech. Just tell them, in whatever form the telling can take, what they're seeing you meant. Not what it produced, not the credential or the job or the outcome, but what the act of being seen meant. Because the thing that Sandra Ashworth gave Claire was not access to a career. It was not a scholarship or a connection or a professional introduction. It was the knowledge that she was worth seeing. And that knowledge, that foundational, portable, completely independent knowledge, went with Claire into every room she ever entered. It was there at the corner of Hargroves where she sat with her salmon and her paperback. It was there when she picked up the phone and dialed from memory. It was there when she said, "The salmon was excellent," and walked out into the cool October night. It will be there in every room she enters for the rest of her life. That is what being genuinely seen by someone who matters to you produces. Not a moment. A posture. A way of moving through the world that says, without saying anything, that you know what you are worth and you came here not to prove it but to use it. That is the gift. And it begins with one person saying, "I see you. I know what this is. Keep going." And here is what I want to ask you. Not rhetorically. Actually and directly. Think about the last time someone sorted you. When someone looked at you and determined, before you opened your mouth or finished a sentence or had any real opportunity to demonstrate who you actually were, that you belonged in a particular category. Think about what that felt like in your body, not in your thoughts but in your physical experience of that moment. The slight contraction. The breath that gets a little shorter. The particular quality of holding yourself together in a room that has just decided you don't belong in it. And then I want you to think about what you did. Because that is the question that determines everything about who you are becoming. Did you perform the retreat they were looking for? Did you make yourself smaller so the room would be more comfortable? Did you give them the reaction, the flush, the flinch, the hasty departure, that confirmed their assessment? Or did you do what Claire did? Did you stay still? Did you keep eating your dinner? Did you hold your own dignity with both hands and refuse, quietly, without announcement, without any requirement that the room acknowledge the refusal, to let someone else's insufficient understanding of you become the operating truth of the moment? Because that is what Claire did. And it was not easy. We should not pretend it was easy just because she made it look that way. It takes years to build that kind of composure. It takes a mother who told you the strongest people in the room are the ones you don't hear coming. It takes a childhood in which you learn that stillness is not the absence of feeling, it is a disciplined, chosen, completely sovereign response to feeling. And it takes the particular, hard-earned knowledge that your value is not located in the opinion of the person across the table. It was there before they looked at you. It will be there after they have looked away. And I want to ask you something else. Think about Douglas Merritt after October 14th. Not the losing the deal part, though that is real and that matters. Think about the part that came after. The 14 months of quiet change. The longer pauses. The questions asked instead of assessments delivered. The catering staff spoken to individually at the holiday dinner. The scholarship check sent with no name attached and a note that asked for nothing in return. Because that part of the story is also real. And it is the part that I think we sometimes leave out when we tell stories about powerful people who do wrong. We stop at the moment of consequence and we call that the ending. But consequence is not the same as change. And Douglas Merritt, for all his profound and costly failures of seeing, eventually found his way to something more honest than the man he had been. Not through a dramatic conversion. Not through a single moment of insight. But through the slow, uncomfortable, deeply private work of looking at yourself accurately and deciding, not grandly, not publicly, just quietly and alone in the morning, to try to be different. That is not a triumphant ending. But it is a real one. And real endings are almost always more durable than the satisfying ones, because they don't complete a story. They continue it. Now I want to ask you something directly. Not rhetorically. Actually and directly, person to person, because I think you deserve the real question and I think you are capable of the honest answer. Think about the last time someone sorted you. When someone looked at you and determined, before you opened your mouth or finished a sentence or had any real opportunity to demonstrate who you actually were, that you belonged in a particular category. Think about what that felt like in your body, not in your thoughts, but in the physical experience of that specific moment. The slight contraction in your chest. The breath that becomes a little shorter. The way your hands find something to do because you need somewhere to put the energy of being seen incorrectly. The particular quality of holding yourself together in a room that has just decided something about you that is not true. And then think about what you did. Because that is the question that determines everything about who you are in the process of becoming. Did you perform the retreat they were looking for? Did you make yourself smaller so the room would be more comfortable? Did you give them the reaction, the flinch, the flush, the early departure, that confirmed their assessment? Or did you stay still? Did you keep your spine straight? Did you find, somewhere inside you, the version of Claire's composure that is available to every person who has ever sat in that kind of chair and been seen incorrectly and known it and chose, quietly, without announcement, without any requirement that the room acknowledge the choice, not to agree? Because I want you to know something. That kind of steadiness is not a personality trait. It is not something you either have or you don't. It is a practice. It is something that builds. It is built, grain by grain, through the accumulation of moments where you chose your own understanding of yourself over the room's understanding. And every time you make that choice, even imperfectly, even while your hands are not entirely steady and your heart is going faster than you'd like, you are adding to it. You are building the thing that Claire had. You are building the thing Sandra Ashworth spent 22 years of double shifts investing in. And the day will come when someone slides a phone across a table toward you. And you will know, without thinking about it, exactly what to do. Think also about the Nathaniel Graves in your life. The person who saw you before you had the credentials. Who believed in what you were becoming before it had arrived. Who said, explicitly or through the simple, powerful act of their investment, I see what this is. Keep going. Think about the teacher who kept your paper. The mentor who called you back. The parent who sacrificed something they never mentioned so you could have access to something you needed. The colleague who said your name in a room when you were not in it. The friend who told you to apply for the thing you didn't think you were ready for and was right. These people exist in most lives, if you are willing to look for them with honesty rather than only cataloging what has been hard. They are often quiet about what they have done. They often don't require acknowledgement. Nathaniel Graves framed the bar certificate and placed it in the conference room and said 3 words, she earned it, and that was the full extent of the announcement he needed to make. Because the investment had been made years earlier. Because the outcome had already arrived. Because some things don't need announcing. They just need to exist, plainly and durably, in the spaces where people who matter can see them. If someone has been that for you, and I hope someone has, I genuinely and sincerely hope someone has, tell them what it meant. Not what it produced. Not the credential or the outcome or the career milestone. Tell them what the act of being seen meant. Because the gift was not the opportunity. The gift was the knowledge that you were worth seeing. And that knowledge, once genuinely held, goes everywhere with you. It was at Hargrove's with Claire when she picked up that phone. It will be with her in every room she enters for the rest of her life. What Claire understood, what Sandra Ashworth's years of investment had built into the architecture of how her daughter moved through the world, is that dignity is not conditional on recognition. It does not require the room to see it in order to be real. It exists in the 20% tip left for a server who did nothing wrong. In the decision to finish your dinner before you leave. In the 4 words said on the way out the door, not in anger, not in triumph, just in the simple, complete, undefended truth of a woman who knows who she is and does not need to prove it to anyone. That is the thing that Douglas Merritt could not buy or build or rehearse or perform his way into. Freedom from the need for validation. The particular sovereignty of a person whose identity has never depended on whether the room agreed with it. He could not recognize it when he saw it because it was exactly what he had always needed and never fully had. And in that gap, in the distance between who he was performing and who he actually was, lay the real story of October 14th. Not Claire's story. His. That is the story of the night at Hargrove's restaurant. And that is the story of the 14 months that followed it. And that is the story of two people who began that Thursday evening as total strangers and ended it, though neither of them knew it at the time, though neither of them could have predicted in any of its specifics what the next 14 months would bring, permanently changed by having been in the same room at the same moment. Douglas Merritt carrying a loss he knew he had earned and a new, uncomfortable, gradually becoming bearable willingness to sit with what that meant about who he had been. Claire Ashworth walking into the cool October night with her coat buttoned and her paperback in her bag and her document folder under her arm and her dignity entirely, completely, unequivocally intact, not because the room had finally recognized it, but because it had never required the room to recognize it in order to be real. That is the difference between the two of them. That is the whole story, compressed into its essential element. One person's identity depended on the room. The other person's identity did not. And every choice both of them made that evening flowed directly from that single, foundational difference. Before you go, I want to leave you with something to actually do, not just feel, but do, because this story deserves more than a feeling. It deserves an action that you take into the world outside this video. So here it is. In the next 24 hours, think of one person in your life who has been underestimated by the people around them. Maybe it is someone at work, quiet, methodical, the person who produces work that is better than it appears in meetings because they don't perform their competence loudly enough for the loudest people in the room to register it. Maybe it is a family member who is in the middle of becoming something that the people around them cannot yet see because it does not yet have an official title or a visible credential attached to it. Maybe it is a friend who is studying at night, working a job that doesn't announce itself, driving a car with 80,000 miles on it, moving towards something they have always known they were moving toward, with a consistency and a patience that the people around them mistake for stalling. Maybe it is someone sitting quietly in a room you share, not performing for anyone, not asking for anything, just being who they are with the particular self-possession of someone who has never needed the room's agreement. And I want you to see them. Not as a performance of seeing. Not in a gesture designed to be witnessed by others. Just genuinely, the way Nathaniel Graves saw Claire in 45 minutes of conversation and made a decision that took 6 years to fully arrive at its conclusion. See them and tell them, in whatever form the telling can take, that you see what this is. That you know what it is becoming. That they are not invisible to you. And watch, carefully, honestly, with full attention to what actually happens, what that does. Watch what it does to them. And watch what it does to you. Thank you for watching all the way to the very end of this story. That genuinely means everything to us. If this moved you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when someone looked at you and decided, before they knew anything real about you, what category you belonged in, we want to hear about it in the comments. Tell us what happened. Tell us what you did. Tell us what you wish you had done, or what you are proud of yourself for doing, or what you are still carrying because it never fully resolved. Tell us what you would have done if you had been Claire at that table. Or if you had been Douglas, sitting alone at the end of that evening with the knowledge of what you had done and what it had cost. And if you've never experienced being sorted the way Claire was sorted, if you've been lucky enough or shielded enough that it has not happened to you in a visible way, I want you to ask yourself, as honestly as you can, whether you have been Douglas in some room, in some moment, at some point in your life. Not the restaurant version. But some version. And what you want to do about that. We read every single comment on this channel. Every one. Your voice here is not a footnote. It is part of the story this community is telling together, one real experience at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, not for the numbers, but because there is someone in your life right now who is sitting quietly somewhere being underestimated by people who have not taken the time to actually look. Share it with them. Let them know that the room always finds out. That character always outlasts performance. That the strongest people in the room are almost always the ones you don't hear coming. And make sure you are subscribed and have the notification bell on, because the next story we are bringing you is about a single conversation inside a hospital waiting room that exposed a secret that had been kept for over 20 years, and left an entire family rewriting everything they thought they knew about themselves, about each other, and about the years they had spent living inside a story that turned out not to be true. It begins quietly. It arrives like a wave. And it will stay with you for a very long time. We will see you there. Don't miss it.